Hello. Sorry for the break in regular content. My real life teaching job made it difficult to find time, but I am back. Enough! And Dead by Daylight has had a few updates. 6.4.0 and the Night spurred on the rise of the 3-gen meta, the Skull Merchant has arrived on the scene and really taught people to appreciate Nurse, and a number of big changes to some perks and medkits. Even though I've been unable to make YouTube content lately, I've still been streaming a ton of DBD on Twitch, so have no fear, I've suffered it all. Which brings us to today's topic. Is Dead by Daylight beyond repair? What I mean by this is, has the game shifted so far in one direction that there's no way back? To cover this, we're first going to look back at what it is that makes Dead by Daylight so good. Then we'll look at the recent chapter releases of the Night and Skull Merchant, and how they've affected the game. We'll discuss the current state of DBD and its direction and touch on my favourite game design methodology, the MDA model, before we finalise by really delving into the potential rising issues within DBD. Quite a lot to go through today. Interestingly, back in December I pondered if DBD was now boring. Let's see if 4 months of updates has helped this situation at all. In my first video on this channel, I found myself as a stern defender of the game, primarily from a design perspective. We discussed the core loop and the simplicity of the overall game. Both Survivor and Killer have clear objectives, which make the game easy to understand as both a player and a viewer. We also discussed some other key phrases. These were agency, affordance, and intentionality. Let me quickly go over them again briefly. Agency refers to the satisfying power to make meaningful action and see the results of our decisions and choices. It's the idea that within digital media, it is our ability to make choices and decisions with which we can derive pleasure. So, as a survivor, we can choose to work on a generator or go for the unhook. Or as a killer, I can persevere with a particular chase or check on a close by generator. But ultimately, one facet of the game is the most enjoyable and most eventful in terms of agency. That being the chase element between killer and survivor. Do I drop the pallet early? Do I greed it? Do I respect the pallet or risk taking the stun to get a potential hit? There are many split-second decisions you make during a chase in DBD on both sides. This is arguably the most exhilarating part of the game. With split-second decision making in play, it's important for players to know what their options are with lightning-fast reactions. This brings us to affordances. The idea of these is something that you intuitively can understand just by looking at it. Pallets, for example, are positioned and angled in a way that suggests they can be pulled down. Lockers are tall and large enough to suggest you can hide inside them, and vaults are short enough that implies you can get over them. Notice how any vault that isn't a window tends to include a tarp to further clarify its use. As a survivor, you quickly learn to recognise these three options, and they become affordances. All using the same keybind, they are kept as simple as possible, making the game very easy to understand and accessible to a wider audience. This brings us to intentionality, which is, as described by Steve Lee, making conscious choices with specific goals and expectations in mind. Intentionality relies on giving the player 4 varying elements: choice or agency, a goal or motivation such as escaping or killing, information or affordances in the game, and lastly, time to process that information, which can be within a split second. Basically, what I am saying is what makes Dead by Daylight so good is chases, quick intentional decision making during a chase between killer and survivor, the back and forth, mind games, looping around a tile and using your perks effectively. DBD is at its strongest when it is simple and easy to understand, but with lots of room to master. So surely the game design prioritises protecting this fun, accessible element, right? There has been 2 major chapter releases, 6.4.0 bringing the Night, and 6.6.0 bringing the Skull Merchant. Let's start with the Night. TheHotCross was a fairly weak killer on release, but he did somewhat excel in one element. He was a fantastic 3-genning machine. With Call of Brine, Overcharge and Eruption, he couldn't really be beat outside of some strong coordination and a whole lot of patience. But the killer community quickly realised something. The strength of the 3-gen meta was amplified on even stronger killers. Thus began quite a difficult time in Dead by Daylight for many. The meta became more stale than perhaps ever before. People began to miss the days of Old Ruin Undying. The frustration from players became so much in fact that in 6.6.0, Eruption was gutted to prevent the 3-gen meta from continuing to strangle the player base. Oh, Just kidding, Overcharge and Call of Brine remained, along with a new killer, Skull Merchant. Adriana Amai is potentially the most powerful 3-gen killer in the game, making games last upwards of 40 minutes if they so choose. They can hold a 3-gen with their trusty sidekicks of Call of Brine and Overcharge seemingly forever, slowing things even further with her trusty drones. Though, still a strong tactic, fortunately Call of Brine and Overcharge received similar nerfs in 6.7.0's patch, as did Scourge Hook Pain Resonance, Dead Hard, Boon Circle of Healing, healing speeds generally, and more. What I find interesting about both of these killers is their design seems counter to the core element I believe that makes Dead by Daylight so good. Further to this, the reaction to remedy newfound issues is to rebalance and nerf perks. This concerns me about huge oversights in the killer's overall designs. Perhaps the two most hard done by perks in this situation are Scourge Hook Pain Resonance and Dead Hard. Two wildly popular perks in the meta, Pain Res felt like an absolutely fine perk to me. I'm not quite sure I understand those who felt Dead Hard was too strong. I can only imagine the same people that shake their fist in the air when a survivor used head on. But let's take a closer look at the Pain Res rework. Pain Res used to be quite simple. Hook a survivor on one of 4 randomly spawned Scourge hooks, 15% gen regression to the highest progressed gen, making any survivors on it scream and let go briefly. More complex than some perks, but easy enough to understand. But now there's more. It now features tokens. Each survivor has a token which is used when first hooked upon a Scourge hook. This results in a similar effect as before, except now it's 25% regression to the generator. To me, it's a little convoluted. A killer must now track these tokens on top of everything else they have to do when using this perk. It's still a strong perk, I just think it's a bit messy. Dead Hard having similar extra detail added to it to appease any killer silly enough to wait it out for upwards of 9 seconds. Dead Hard now working as it did before, but now only activates after being unhooked or unhooking yourself. So if tunneled, you'll get no value if you are struck by the killer and put into the deep wound state. Also, this limits the exhaustion perk to 2 uses maximum per match, so it's effectively a dead perk. But my issue is it is more mess added onto its functionality. So here is my issue about these changes. Whether you believe they are for the better or worse, we're introducing new killers which I don't feel are supportive of what for me is the best part of the game, while simultaneously adding new rules and stipulations to fun existing perks. Now admittedly, the 3-gen perk problem was there prior, people just didn't really spot it until the night, but it feels like there is no real vision of what DBD is meant to be at the moment, or maybe not being explicitly communicated at least, although one element does seem clear, which means we're going to have to go back to the age-old DBD debate. I know I maybe just came across quite disgruntled with the recent updates, but there is at least one thing they've done well. The game is increasingly more balanced, and the meta does seem to be shaken up more frequently these days than ever before. What I mean is, I feel it's increasingly difficult for killers to complain about there being one collection of survivor perks or items which are unfair in some way. I mean, people still will obviously, but with even medkits being nerfed as well now, it's never been better to play killer. Having said that, Survive with Friends equally now have far less room to complain about killer perks or playstyles, as they are increasingly brought on a more equal playing field. Solo queue does still have some balance issues itself though, but we'll discuss that in a little bit more detail shortly. But why are killers still complaining, or using strategies that involve camping or tunneling at 5 gens as if they stand no chance of winning if they don't? It might have something to do with the fact that the game is more balanced. Shocker, I know. If you look at any balanced competitive games, you'll struggle to find a large casual player base. League of Legends and Overwatch 2 for example. The sort of games you can only really play if you want to sweat a bit, lose yourself in the try-hard environment, which can be fun in a very different way. Swift and killer gameplay is a bit like that. MMR, in theory, ensures your games are competitive back and forths. You can't blame a killer for trying really hard to win when the game's design encourages the belief that they will be going up against an equally competitive team. The trouble is, there are these pesky solo queue or casual players which continue to make up the vast majority of the player base. This particular group isn't playing competitively, they don't have open comms and tile callouts on hand, they're just relaxing and playing a video game. And this is where the debate sits. Who is the game for? Well, to figure that out, I would like to discuss my favourite game design methodology in a bit of detail. In 2004, Hunik, LeBlanc and Zubek established a new model to be used when designing a game. It was named the MDA model. These stand for Mechanics, dynamics, and aesthetics. Mechanics describes the particular components of the game, at the level of data representation and algorithms. It's something the player cannot change, embedded data such as maximum amount of players per side, how many generators spawn, or how long you remain exhausted after using sprint burst. Essentially, it's the rules of the game. Dynamics describes the runtime behaviour of the mechanics acting on player inputs and each other's outputs over time. So this could be how a player might interact with and use perks. For example, you might use Dead Man's Switch with the killer Nemesis with the idea that zombies might push survivors off of generators. Or, when playing Survivor with Quick and Quiet, you might use this tool to secretly use a vault or hide in a locker during a chase. It's the system of the game. Wake up! And finally, aesthetics. Not to be confused with visuals, in this case it's what describes the desirable emotional responses evoked in the player when she interacts with the game's system. It's the production of adrenaline for specific situations. It's how tense it can be when you're wondering if a stealth killer is nearby. It's the feeling of immersion as you lean forwards in an M1 attack. It's how the game makes you feel. From a development perspective, we tend to design games by figuring out the rules first, then the system, and then test to see if it's fun. What the MDA model suggests is that, as developers, you should design in reverse. So figure out the aesthetic feeling you hope to create, then work backwards, crafting dynamics and mechanics to ensure this feeling is achieved. So why do I bring this up? Because I believe behaviour need to seriously consider what emotional aesthetic they want Dead by Daylight to achieve. As stated prior, I think the most fun part of DBD is chases, its loops, mind gaming, its exhilarating moments, horror-fueled chases where you never know what is going to happen next. The two most recent killers do not encourage that element of the game particularly well. Instead, they encourage you to be fairly static, repetitive in your behaviour, staring at generators as both survivor and killer. Behaviour recently published a new satisfaction survey in late March 2023. We're still waiting for the results. They did ask some interesting questions relating to how one perceives the game, competitive or casual. With the game being so heavily populated by solo queue survivors, I suspect most prefer to see the game fairly casually still, but MMR, win conditions being based off of kills rather than hooks, and constant attempts to balance the gameplay all suggest a competitive direction. My point is that the design decisions as of late would suggest DBD is a competitive game, which 3 gens and stall tactics are a powerful tool to be used. You can't blame players for doing it, the game design is driven towards it. But why do I consider this to be an issue? Okay, I want to do a little exercise. Close your eyes. You're playing killer, your favourite killer. You're loading into the match. You see a survivor bring a map offering. How do you feel? I have another question. You load into the next match. There's no map offering this time, but the map is Garden of Joy, Leary's, Gas Heaven, Eyrie of Crows, Mother's Dwelling, Badham Preschool. How do you feel about any of those maps? I would suspect every single one from a killer's perspective gives you some feeling of dread. Now, survivor players, can you close your eyes? You're playing your favourite survivor in solo queue. You load in, any map you like. You hear a terror radius. How do you feel? Is that a skull merchant? A nurse? Alchemist Ring Blight? Legion? Insidious Bubba? Hit and Run Wraith? Twins? A condemned Sadako? Tombstone Myers? How do you feel? My point is, the game is full of dread-inducing moments for both sides at the moment. Not to say all maps are bad. Cold Tower, Midwich, Dead Dog are all fine. And as for killers, Huntress, Demogorgon, Hillbilly are running around out there too, bringing some fun. And not all of the aforementioned maps or killers are going to be a horrible match. Some of my favourite matches of all time are on those maps or against those killers. But when I see a Bubba, I assume the worst at this point. When I hear Skull Merchant, I know what kind of match I'm probably in for. It's not a good aesthetic feeling to have present in the game. As stated prior, agency is important. Giving killers options for how they might win, be it slugging survivors with condemned Sadako, instantly tombstone Moriing with infinite tier 3 Myers, hit and run killers making survivors feel unable to freely move towards more open important generators, stalling with Deadlock and face camping Bubba, or the 3-gen meta itself slowly making any survivor regret loading into the match. All effective tactics to win, but not effective at generating a fun environment for gameplay, at least for survivors. And without hard blocking generators with corrupt intervention or something like it, survivors have nothing to do at the moment outside of rushing generators, which with a good squad usually means a killer is sat wondering what they could have done differently as the match just sort of comes to an abrupt end. Dead by Daylight does not function as a competitive game for one giant reason for me: RNG. Recently, Otzdava tweeted an image which suggested RNG was the least determining factor for the outcome of a DBD match. What I found quite interesting about the image here is, in solo queue, which remember is the majority of Survivor players, experience of your teammates, the resources brought into the match, and mindset of how each player feels about any given killer or DBD at the time are all RNG factors as well. And that's even before we mention the RNG of gen spawns, pallets available, vaults, player spawns, the map, items in chests, hook locations, and so on. The image is probably more directed to swift or killer gameplay, as we suggested earlier, the more competitive playstyles. Do you know how much RNG there is when you load into a game of Overwatch 2? Minimal. It's all player skill based. League of Legends, the same. Minimal. The maps are consistent, the only varying factor is other players, their champions of choice, and their skill levels, which MMR seeks to minimalise. That's what allows these games to be competitive. So what's my point? What's the issue? Behaviour are adjusting important values, like generator repair speed, healing, and killer actions, which affect the core loop. They're also adding new rules to fun perks, and rebalancing the meta continually now to adapt to killers which feel poorly designed, when to me, they just need to make a choice. If the game is competitive, then map design should be their focus. Garden of Joy, the game, the Shattered Square, etc. are terribly designed. If the game is to be taken seriously, maps need to become more consistent. RNG should be reduced as much as possible. This is not the option I would choose though. I would advocate for a second option. A rework and refocus on the most fun part of the game: chases. Killers should be encouraged to get more hooks, and a win should be determined based off of this. Give killers a blood point bonus for it as well, or something for hooking different survivors to discourage tunneling. A 12 hook game should give a killer a firework display. Survivors need side objectives again. Hex totems are awesome, use them more. Deny survivors bringing in items. You can boost the strength of a toolbox but make it spawn randomly in a chest. Delete map offerings, make the map always an RNG factor. DBD is currently in a weird middle ground between consistent competitive gameplay or chaotic RNG based. In my opinion, it needs to pick a road. There is a silver lining though. The recent satisfaction survey suggests behaviour are reconsidering their direction, asking their players how they perceive the game, competitive or casual. What this will mean is hard to say, but it does give me some hope for DBD's future, given quite a rocky few chapter releases in a row now. Players seem to be increasingly sour on the game, streamers are moving away from DBD as are many other players. And without a solid direction, I think this could spell disaster for the game's health, especially with potential new competitors not far off in the distance. But that's how I feel about the current state of DBD. But what do you think? And where do you see the direction of the game leading? Do you think DBD should lean into its competitive spirit or turn back to its more casual roots? Thank you so much for watching, let me know what you think in the comments below and I will catch you on the flip side. Peace!